Hello friends, are you ready to see how a border principality transformed into a global state? Everything from clashing swords to ink drops, architectural genius to strategic intelligence is hidden in this story. Please don't forget to like the video and mention your favorite song in the comments. I'm curious. On the 29th of October 2023, Turkey marked 100 years since the Republic declared itself new and modern, born from the wreckage of an older order. That date carries a quiet accusation. It asks how a state that ruled for more than 6 centuries collapsed into hunger, occupation, and emergency councils, then re-emerged with a different flag. To answer that, we need to start with the story about the movement. Picture cold wind scraping over grass that seems to go on forever. Horses breathe hard in the dark. Leather saddles creak. A man's hand closes around a bow grip polished by sweat. Somewhere behind him, women feed a fire with dried dung. The flame burns low and steady and smells like survival. These early Turks did not dream of Istanbul. They followed pasture and pressure. They drifted west over generations, pushed by rival tribes, pulled by opportunity, and shaped by the hard mathematics of grass and water. Then they met something older, heavier, and richer than anything on the steppe. By the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks stood at the edge of the Byzantine world. Byzantium still called itself Rome, still held court rituals that smelled of incense and authority, still imagined itself as the center of Christian power in the East. But empires can rot while the paint remains fresh. In 1071, at Manzikert, the Seljuks under Alparon struck the Byzantines hard enough to change the rules of the game. Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV walked into the fight expecting obedience from his commanders. He got betrayal and panic instead. The Seljuks won, and the shockwave opened Anatolia to Turkish conquest and settlement. In Anatolia, you can hear empire in small details. You hear it in a market where the language shifts at each stall. You hear it in the prayers muttered in a different tongue. You hear it in the rhythm of taxes and in the way of farmers' shoulders tense when a rider appears on the road. After Manzikert, Anatolia began to fill with Turk war bands, families, and holy men. They did not arrive as a single nation. They came as rival groups, each trying to carve out a place. They fought Byzantines, but they also fought each other. Power looked like a fortified hill and a good marriage alliance. Faith looked like a preacher who could make fear feel holy. 2 centuries later, the Seljuk order in Anatolia weakened and cracked. The Mongol pressure from the east slammed into the region and left fractures that never fully healed. Out of those fractures rose small principalities. Beys ruled from rough fortresses surrounded by men who valued raid and reward. This is where the Ottomans enter the story, not as inevitable emperors, but as one more hungry household in a crowded room. The founder, Osman, sits at the center of a problem every historian hates. We want a clean origin story, a neat hero, a clear beginning. But Osman lives behind fog. The sources that describe him arrived late, polished by propaganda and piety. Written by people who needed a founder to look like destiny. Even his name becomes a kind of brand. Later writers wrap him in dreams and prophecies, because an empire prefers a sacred birth. So strip away the legend, and what remains still matters. Osman likely led a small frontier community in northwestern Anatolia around the end of the 13th century. He faced Byzantines whose defenses had thinned, whose frontier garrison sometimes went unpaid, whose local lords negotiated as much as they fought. Osman's men moved fast. They rode out at dawn. They carried simple gear, not courtly finery. They attacked where walls looked tired, where defenders felt alone. They took animals, grain, captives, and prestige. And here the first irony begins to form. The Ottomans did not rise by building a polished bureaucracy first. They rose by perfecting a frontier style of violence, then learning how to turn that violence into administration. A raid gives you loot once. A tax system feeds your army every year. The transformation from raiders to rulers becomes the true early conquest. Osman's son, Orhan, pushed that transformation further. Under Orhan, the Ottomans grabbed Bursa and made it more than a prize. They made it a seat. You can imagine the change in texture immediately. The rough wool cloak meets silk. Coins clink in a market instead of being buried in a saddlebag. Judges and scribes begin to matter as much as horsemen. The smell of cooked lamb and bread mixes with ink and wax seals. But Orhan did not stop with cities. He crossed into Europe, and that leap changes everything. The Balkans held wealth, manpower, and strategic position. They also held Christian populations that could be ruled, taxed, and recruited. The Ottoman state begins to look like something new because it learns to do something cold and methodical. It begins to collect boys. This is the Devsham idea in its early form. The child levy that later generations would whisper about with dread and resignation. Officials arrive in a village, count, select, and take. Mothers cry out. Fathers bargain. Some families hide sons. Others, desperate and calculating, try to present a boy who might rise in the system and send money back. The practice grows and formalizes over time, but its logic is clear from the start. The Ottomans needed soldiers and administrators who owed loyalty to the Sultan alone, not to local clans. They created them by taking children from Christian subjects and remaking them. Out of that machinery came the Janissaries, a corps that would become both the empire's sharpest weapon and later one of its worst internal problems. In the 14th century, Ottoman rulers organized this elite infantry tied directly to the Sultan, trained with discipline that shocked their enemies. A boy taken from a village could become a soldier who marched in step, carried a musket, and stood firm while cavalry broke and ran. The Janissaries were not just fighters. They were proof that the Sultan could manufacture loyalty. That is a terrifying kind of power. Under Murad I, the Ottomans pushed deeper into the Balkans. They shifted their center of gravity toward Europe. They took Adrianople, later called Edin, and used it as a capital. It sat close enough to Constantinople to feel like a hand on the Byzantine throat. In the streets of Edirne, you would have smelled horse, sweat, and smoke from cooking fires, heard craftsmen hammering armor, and watched envoys from Balkan courts arrive with gifts that looked like submission wrapped in velvet. Then came Kosovo in 1389. The battlefield was not a clean chessboard. It was chaos, mud, and screams. Miad's troops met a coalition of Serb forces. Both sides bled heavily. Murad died during the battle, assassinated amid the confusion, and the Ottomans still emerged dominant. His death matters for more than drama. It demonstrates a brutal truth. The Ottoman machine had grown beyond any single man. Even the Sultan could fall, and the state would keep moving. His successor, Bazid pushed with speed and arrogance, earning the name Thunderbolt. In 1396, at Nicopolis, Western knights marched east, expecting glory. They brought confidence like perfume, thick and suffocating. Bazid met them with discipline and timing. Ottoman troops crushed the crusading force and reminded Europe that this new power did not play by old rules. And then, in 1402, the empire nearly snapped. Timur marched west with a force that looked like an apocalypse to anyone standing in its path. Bazid met him near Ankara, and the battle unraveled in a way that exposes a second early irony. Bayezid had built his army partly by absorbing other Anatolian Turkish principalities. In battle, some of those groups defected back to Timur. The empire's strength, its rapid expansion and absorption of rivals, became a weakness in a single afternoon of betrayal. Timur won. He captured Bozid, the only Ottoman sultan to end up in an enemy's hands. Bozid died in captivity the next year. After Ankara, the Ottoman world did not look like a rising empire. It looked like scavengers circling a wounded animal. Bazid's sons fought each other in an internal struggle. This period, later called the Ottoman Interregnum, turned brother against brother and province against province. Merchants who once paid taxes to one authority now paid bribes to survive. Local lords tested independence. Enemies circled. Byzantine leaders, still clinging to their battered capital, watched and tried to exploit the fracture, playing Ottoman claimants against each other like a gambler shuffling cards. The empire survived because one of Bayezid's sons, Memdi, outmaneuvered the others and rebuilt the center. He restored order through a combination of negotiation, force, and careful consolidation. He proved that the Ottoman state could take a direct hit and recover. That resilience becomes one of its defining traits. Murad II followed, and he ruled like a man who understood the cost of weakness. He fought in the Balkans. He clashed with European coalitions that tried again and again to push the Ottomans back. At Va in 1444, a crusading army marched with the confidence of men who believed God preferred their side. Murad shattered them. The battlefield smelled of wet soil and iron. The dead lay in heaps, armor dented, faces slack, eyes open to a sky that did not care. By the time Murad died, he left his son a powerful state and a clear objective: Constantinople. The city did not just sit on a map. It sat in the imagination. For Byzantines, it was a sacred fortress protected by walls that had held back enemies for centuries. For Ottomans, it was a symbol that mocked them. It split their territories. It controlled the Bosphorus. It carried a prestige that could turn a frontier dynasty into an imperial power with a capital worthy of its ambition. Mehmed II came to the throne, young and youth, did not make him gentle. It made him hungry. He read, planned, listened, and waited. He also understood that taking Constantinople required more than courage. It required logistics, money, and technology. So, he built a cannon. Not a symbolic cannon, a monster of bronze that shook the ground when it fired. The gun crew sweated under its weight, their hands blackened with soot and oil. When the cannon spoke, the sound rolled over the hills like thunder, then slammed into the land walls of the city with a force that made stone crumble and men flinch. The siege began in early April 1453. Mehmed surrounded the city from land and sea and kept up a constant barrage. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine X11th, fought with desperation. They patched breaches with rubble and bodies. They hauled stones and wood while praying for aid that would not come in time. And now you can feel the sensory reality of the turning point. Inside the city, hunger sharpened everything. Bread turned thin. Water smelled stale in the systems. The air in churches filled with wax and fear. The sound of cannon fire became a clock. Each blast reminded people that the walls were not eternal. In the Ottoman camp, the atmosphere carried a different weight. Soldiers cooked over smoky fires. Imams preached in strong voices, promising paradise for martyrs. Janissaries drilled with a precision that felt inhuman. The stomp of boots turning the earth into packed clay. The city's walls had held against Arab sieges, against Rus raids, against crusaders and emperors and pretenders. But gunpowder changed the math. The walls could still kill attackers in waves, but they could no longer guarantee survival. That is one of history's cruelest jokes. Byzantium perfected walls. The world invented cannons. In late May, after weeks of pounding, the moment came. Mehmed ordered the final assault. He drove his men forward in waves. Each wave meant to exhaust the defenders. Each wave meant to test weak points. Each wave meant to spill blood until resistance broke. On the 29th of May 1453, Ottoman forces breached the land wall and poured into the city. Constantine XI died, fighting as the defense collapsed. Mehmed entered Constantinople not as a tourist, not as a looter, but as a ruler, claiming a prize he believed belonged to him by right of strength and destiny. He moved through streets that smelled of smoke and panic. He stepped over broken doors and abandoned shoes. He listened to the city's silence, the kind that follows catastrophe when people either hide or die. Then he did something that reveals the Ottoman method in its most essential form. He did not only destroy, he appropriated. He turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque, not merely as an insult, but as a statement that the center of gravity had shifted. The city would not remain a wounded Byzantine relic. It would become the seat of an empire that had outgrown its frontier origins. And yet, even here, the ironies keep forming. The Ottoman victory depended on a military system that rewarded discipline and loyalty, including the Janissaries. That system would later become a political force capable of threatening sultans. The victory depended on a ruler willing to act with cold ruthlessness. That ruthlessness would later crystallize into law, including rules that permitted fratricide in the name of stability. A state that claimed order would repeatedly purchase that order with blood inside its own family. Mehmed did not walk into Constantinople and simply take a city. He took a problem that had eaten emperors for 1,000 years, and he solved it with gunpowder, hunger, and patience. Then he faced a harder task, the one that does not look heroic in paintings. He had to make conquest last. A dead city gives you nothing. A living capital gives you everything. So he stood in streets that still smelled of smoke and fear. And he began to rebuild Istanbul as a machine for rule. He brought in craftsmen and merchants. He repaired walls that his own cannons had cracked. He filled warehouses. He issued orders that traveled out from the palace like blood through veins. He understood something that frontier warlords often miss. A cavalry charge wins an afternoon. A tax register wins a century. Topkapi rose above the water like a guarded promise. Inside its gates, you could feel the empire learning how to breathe. Courtyards opened, one after another, each more controlled, each more silent. Guards in clean uniforms watched every corner, shoes scuffed on stone. In the inner rooms, silk-cuffed hands slid over shoulders, soft as water, embroidered with gold thread that caught torchlight and made men look richer than they were. In the harem, the quiet could feel physical, like a pressure on the ears. Curtains hung still. A servant carried a tray without letting the cups clink. The women who lived there learned every footstep and every mood. They learned which corridor meant danger, which door meant a summons, which whisper meant a prince had gained favor or lost it. Mehmed knew the palace could become a nest of rival loyalties, so he designed it to keep the center tight and the edges obedient. He wanted his authority to feel unavoidable. His appetite did not end at the city walls. He hunted the last scraps of Byzantine power and the last pockets of resistance that might one day invite European armies to return. He drove into the Peloponnese and finished off the Desperate of the Morea, the last Byzantine remnant in Greece, and he treated surrender as a tool, not a mercy. He used honor when it served him and execution when it frightened others into compliance. He turned east and took Trebizond, the final outpost of the Cominian line on the Black Sea, ending another thread of Byzantine legitimacy. He moved into Bosnia, a land of fortresses and contested faith, and he absorbed it into his domain by force and by administration, tightening Ottoman reach into the Western Balkans. Each new conquest came with its own smell. Wet timber in mountain forts, sweat and wool in marching camps, smoke from villages burned as punishment, incense in churches that would soon answer to Istanbul. He did not rule by charm. He ruled by certainty. Then he turned his eyes toward the sea. The Venetian Republic had money, ships, and nerve. Venice did not kneel easily, and it controlled routes that the Ottomans wanted for profit and control. The fighting with Venice dragged on for years, a grinding contest of sieges, raids, and naval clashes that proved an empire could bleed slowly even while it grew. Mehmed responded the way he always did. He built capacity. He expanded shipyards. He strengthened choke points. He treated shipbuilding as a form of conquest. The salt air of the Golden Horn mixed with pitch and sawdust. Men hammered planks late into the night while clerks counted costs and sultanic officials watched for theft. Ottoman power at sea did not appear by accident. Mehmed forced it into existence. In 1475, he pushed into Crimea, breaking Genoa's dominance and binding the Crimean Khanate into an Ottoman protectorate, giving the empire a hand on the northern Black Sea and a new stream of tribute and leverage. This mattered beyond maps. It meant grain, slaves, horses, and influence in a region where rival powers watched each other like wolves. It also meant the Ottoman state could reach farther than its armies could march, using vassal ties and naval force to extend control. The empire grew smarter, not just bigger. Then came a moment that still feels like a sharp intake of breath when you picture it. In 1480, Ottoman forces landed in southern Italy and seized Otranto. Imagine the shock in Europe. The way a rumor turns into panic before it becomes policy. Churches filled with prayer. Courts argued about whether this was a real invasion or a raid that could be bought off. In Otranto, stone walls trembled and the air filled with smoke and screams as the city fell and people died or were dragged into slavery. Mehmed had been chasing the ghost of Rome ever since he entered Constantinople. He wanted more than a throne. He wanted inheritance. The Italian foothold suggested he might try to stitch the old Roman world under his own house. But fate does not respect ambition. Mehmed died in 1481, and the Italian outpost did not become a permanent Ottoman bridgehead. The empire learned an early lesson it would repeat for centuries. Plans can be grand. A body can still fail. Death did not just remove a ruler. It reopened the oldest wound in monarchy. Succession. Mehmed left sons. And in an empire built on personal authority, a prince did not inherit calm. He inherited enemies. Bazid took the throne, but his brother Sem refused to accept it. Sem fled, fought, lost, and became something far more dangerous than a dead rival. He became a living bargaining chip. European powers and the Knights Hospitaller held him, moved him, and used his existence as a weapon aimed at Istanbul. Bayezid could never fully relax. Sam's name hung over diplomacy like a blade. A pope could threaten to release him. A king could hint at a crusade backed by his claim. Beast paid for silence, negotiated for delays, and watched the West treat an Ottoman prince like a coin. If you want to understand Ottoman paranoia, start here. A rival prince did not need an army if Europe was willing to lend him one. This pressure helped push the Ottoman court toward a brutal kind of rationality. The empire had already survived the interregnum after Ankara, when brothers tore at each other and nearly split the state. Mehmed himself had seen how quickly a dynasty could crumble into factions. The answer he offered was chilling in its simplicity. Remove the rivals early. Make the throne a single point, not a shared prize. The practice of killing brothers existed before Mehmed, but Mehmed formalized and legitimized it as a matter of state order, tied to the idea of preventing fitna and preserving the common good. This is one of the great Ottoman ironies. A state that sought stability codified a method that poisoned its own bloodline. It turned family into a battlefield that began the moment a prince was born. Now picture the palace at night, a corridor lit by oil lamps, a muffled step, a silk cord carried in a gloved hand, no shouting, no spectacle, only a clean silence meant to keep the city calm. This was not rage. This was policy. The tragedy is not only that men died. The tragedy is what the policy did to the living. It trained princes to see brothers as threats, trained mothers to build factions inside the harem, trained visors and guards to calculate loyalty like merchants weighing spices. A system meant to prevent civil war made suspicion permanent. Bazid ruled longer than his father's last fever dream of Italy, and he ruled differently. He preferred consolidation to reckless expansion. He watched the treasury. He tried to keep the empire steady while new storms gathered on the horizon. Yet steadiness has its own price. A ruler who refuses risk can look weak to the hungry men beneath him. He fought Venice again from 1499 to 153, a war shaped by cannon smoke on the sea and the hard fact that coastal forts could starve. If the sea belonged to the enemy, the Ottomans won key victories, including the naval battle at Zonio in 1499, and they took Venetian strongholds like Modon and Coron, tearing out what Venetians once called the eyes of their republic. Imagine the coastal bombardment, the stone walls shuddering as cannonballs struck, the air thick with salt spray and powder, the screams of men on decks splintered by shot. Naval war does not allow clean heroism. It kills with drowning, fire, and panic. The Ottoman state, which had once been a frontier cavalry power, now proved it could fight on the sea with planning and persistence. Bayezid also fought the Mamluk Sultanate in a grinding conflict from 1485 to 1491, a war sparked by contested influence in frontier regions and fueled by pride on both sides. The fighting chewed up men and money and ended with a peace that restored borders largely unchanged. Here is another quiet irony. To Muslim powers that claimed guardianship of sacred places and legitimacy, spent years bleeding each other in a struggle that produced no decisive gain. While Portuguese ships began to threaten the old trade arteries in the Indian Ocean, the world was shifting. The Ottoman court could feel it like a draft under a door, but it did not yet know how to seal the room. This is where Salem enters like a storm. Salem did not inherit patience. He seized power by force. In 1512, he pushed his father off the throne and took the crown for himself. The empire had laws meant to prevent civil war. Yet it still produced a son who decided he could not wait. That is the poison working exactly as designed. The throne went to the man willing to do the worst thing first. Salem ruled only 8 years, but he changed the empire's direction so hard that the rest of the century followed his curve. He acted like a man convinced that hesitation was a form of death. He moved against the Safavids and met Shah Ismail at Chaldan in 1514. The battlefield there was not romantic. It was flat ground, stained by blood, and churned into mud by thousands of feet. Selim brought artillery and disciplined infantry. Ismail brought cavalry and the fervor of men who believed their leader carried divine favor. The guns answered that belief with iron. Ottoman artillery and firearms helped decide the battle, shattering the Safavid attack and forcing Ismail into retreat. Salem briefly occupied Tabriz, but even victory had limits. His own troops, exhausted and wary of pushing deeper, reminded him that an empire's reach depends on men's willingness to keep walking. Chaldan did more than redraw borders. It broke an illusion. It showed that charisma could bleed out under cannon fire. It also set a precedent the Ottomans would keep repeating. When faced with a rival, they preferred overwhelming force and decisive action, even if it created long wars and deeper hatred. Later, Salem then turned south toward the Mamluks, and this time the outcome did not end with a neat border restoration. In 1516, at Marjdakay near Aleppo, the Ottoman army defeated the Mamluk forces, opening Syria to Ottoman rule. In 1517, Salem defeated the Mamluks again at Ronia and took Cairo, bringing Egypt under Ottoman control. Try to imagine the moment the Ottoman troops entered Cairo. The heat sits heavy. The smell of dust and animals thicken the air. The streets crowded with fear and rumor. Soldiers jostle through gates, boots striking stone, their weapons catching sunlight. A great city that had ruled the region for centuries feels the shift in its bones. The Ottoman center of gravity moved. The empire that began as a frontier power in northwestern Anatolia now held the Levant, Egypt, and the Holy City's roots, transforming the Sultan from a conqueror of Christians into a ruler who could claim leadership within the wider Muslim world. Here, the weight of time presses down. You can feel the empire accelerating. In the space of a few generations, the Ottomans went from raiding the edges of Byzantium to ruling a capital that had once been Rome's second heart, then to absorbing Cairo's authority and its immense administrative tradition. The Ottoman state did not just win territory. It collected institutions. It learned how to govern peasants in the Balkans and merchants in Syria, how to tax vineyards in Greece and caravans crossing deserts, how to appoint governors, how to punish them when they grew too proud. But every new layer of strength carried a future weakness inside it. The Janissaries built from coerced loyalty had proven their value again and again. They stood under cannon smoke without breaking. They marched in step while other armies dissolved into chaos. They were a weapon, and Salem used them ruthlessly. Yet the very fact that the Sultan depended on them gave them leverage. Every privilege granted to keep them loyal became a claim they could later defend with threats. Every victory that made them legendary made them harder to control. The same system that allowed a sultan to manufacture obedience would over time create a class of soldiers who believed they owned a piece of the state. The same goes for the palace system. The harem produced heirs, but it also produced alliances, rivalries, and survival instincts sharpened like knives. A mother did not want her son merely to live. She wanted him to win because losing could mean death. A vizier did not want merely to advise. He wanted to attach himself to the prince most likely to survive. The law that claimed to keep order made the inner court a place where love and fear mixed until you could not separate them. If you stand at the edge of the Golden Horn at dawn and listen, you can hear the city waking, merchants shouting, gulls crying above the water. You can smell bread baking and tar on ships, and the faint perfume of the court drifting from behind palace walls. It feels like power made physical, but beneath it, like a low drumbeat, there is a warning. The Ottomans have built a state that can swallow worlds. Yet, it must keep feeding itself with loyalty, money, and blood. The more it grows, the more it requires. That is how empires become tragic, not because they are evil, but because they become hungry in ways that human beings cannot satisfy forever. Salem dies and leaves behind an empire that still smells like fresh conquest. Cairo has barely had time to learn the cadence of Ottoman orders. Damascus still listens for the footsteps of new governors. The holy routes now answer to Istanbul. The treasury swells, and the court begins to believe that God has stamped the dynasty with a permanent yes. Then a young man takes the throne in September 1520, and everyone around him tries to read his face like a cipher. Suleiman does not inherit a crown. He inherits momentum. In the top copper courtyards, morning light spills onto stone and makes the marble look cold enough to bite. Officials move with careful speed. The ink in the scribes' wells gleams like oil. A messenger arrives, breath fogging in the air, and kneels. A janissary guard watches with a stillness that feels rehearsed. In the council chamber, silk capons brush against carved wood, and the faint smell of rosewater sits on top of something sharper, sweat and fear under expensive cloth. Suleiman starts, as many rulers start, by proving he can kill. He points the army northwest and goes after Belgrade. In 1521, he takes it, and that conquest matters because Belgrade is a door. It opens the Danube road into Central Europe and announces that the Ottoman court will not spend Salem's inheritance on gardens and poetry alone. The next year he turns toward Rhodes. The Knights of St. John have held the island like a thorn in Ottoman sea routes. A Christian fortress that raids and interrupts and reminds Istanbul that the Mediterranean is not yet theirs. Suleiman brings siege guns and men who know how to dig, hammer, and endure. The air near the trenches tastes like damp earth and smoke. You can imagine the sound of stone splintering, under cannon shot and the tense quiet between barrages, when defenders and attackers both listen for the next impact. By 1522 and 1523, Rhodes falls and the knights leave. Suleiman's court begins to understand what he is building, not just a realm, but a reputation. Europe hears the names Belgrade and Rhodes and feels the ground shift under old assumptions. Then Hungary becomes the prize. In August 1526 at Mohacs, Suleiman breaks the Hungarian army in a fight so decisive it feels like a trapdoor opening. Rain and mud swallow boots. Horses scream. Armor turns heavy when it gets wet. And men drown in their own equipment if they fall into the wrong ditch. The Hungarian king, Louis I, dies as the monarchy collapses into panic. This is where Ottoman power stops looking like a regional threat and starts looking like a verdict. Hungary does not simply lose a battle, it loses its certainty. A vacant throne attracts predators. Ferdinand, the first of the Habsburgs, wants it. John Zapolya wants it. Suleiman steps into that chaos and plays it like an instrument. He recognizes Apulia as a vassal king because it keeps Hungary divided and keeps the Habsburgs from swallowing the whole country in one bite. Then he goes for Vienna. When people imagine the siege of Vienna in 1529, they often picture banners and heroic speeches. The real story begins in the mud. Autumn rain turns roads into thick, sucking filth. Oxen strain under the weight of artillery pieces. Men curse as wheels sink and refuse to move. Supply wagons lag behind and rot in the distance. Food spoils. Powder gets damp. Horses go lame. By the time the Ottoman army reaches Vienna, the troops have already paid a price just to arrive. The trenches outside the city feel cold and wet, and the air carries the sour stink of latrines, smoke from cooking fires, and damp wool. The defenders watch from walls that have seen other dangers, and they understand something important. If they can endure long enough, winter and distance might fight for them. Solomon pounds the city, but he cannot force it to open. Vienna does not fall. He withdraws, harassed on the route back. Here comes an irony that will repeat for centuries. The Ottomans have the discipline, the artillery, and the will. But Europe has weather, distance, and defensive depth. The Ottoman state can crush kingdoms close to its arteries. It struggles when it reaches too far from the heart. Solomon does not stop fighting in Hungary. But after Vienna, his vision changes. The war drags on in fits and truces, and the borderlands become a permanent wound, bleeding men and money year after year. While Europe fixates on Vienna, Solon turns east and shows that he will not tolerate a rival that can ignite dissent in Anatolia. The Safavids of Iran represent more than a political enemy. They represent a challenge to Ottoman religious authority and a spark that can set heterodox loyalties on fire inside Ottoman territory. So Solomon sends an army that smells of oiled leather and gunpowder and puts pressure where it hurts. His Grand Vizier and closest companion, Ibrahim Pasha, marches into Iran and occupies Tebris in 1534. Then Ottoman forces take Baghdad 5 months later. Baghdad is not just a city. It is a symbol. It carries the memory of older caliphates and older power. When Ottoman officials begin to issue orders there, you can almost hear the empire telling itself a story. We are not merely conquerors. We are inheritors. Ibrahim Pasha matters here because he shows how Sleman rules at his peak. Solomon does not act alone. He chooses a man, elevates him beyond his origins, and makes him the hinge between the throne and the world. Ibrahim negotiates, commands, reforms, and carries the Sultan's authority like a weapon. He goes to Egypt in 1524 and re-establishes his order there, shaping administration and revenue collection. At court, people start to whisper about Ibrahim's ambition. He wears luxury like he was born to it. He uses titles that sound too close to sovereignty. He begins to look less like a servant and more like a second son. Solon watches this and understands a truth about absolute rule. The most dangerous enemy is often the one you created. In 1536, Solon has Ibrahim executed. He does it because he fears for his own throne and because he refuses to share the aura of kingship with anyone. no matter how loyal that person once seemed. Picture the night inside the palace. The lamps burn low. The corridors absorb sound. A man who commanded armies and negotiated with kings finds himself in a room with no audience, no bargaining, no return. The court wakes up the next morning and pretends it did not hear anything. Because survival in an imperial palace often depends on your ability to act as if you believe the official story. This execution is not a side plot. It is the empire teaching itself a lesson. The sultan's power depends on capable servants, but the sultan must never allow those servants to appear indispensable. The state sharpens itself by cutting down the men who make it strong. At the same time, Solon builds an image of order, so convincing that even his enemies have to respect it. He codifies a centralized legal system known as the Qanun, and people begin to call him Qanuni. This is not poetry. This is infrastructure. Laws define taxes, duties, ranks, punishments. They turn conquest into something repeatable. But do not mistake law for mercy. Law under an empire often functions like a blade. It cuts away ambiguity. It makes punishment predictable. It makes extraction efficient. It tells a farmer how much he owes and tells a governor how much he can keep. It creates a state that feels reliable, and reliability can feel like safety, even when it comes with a heavy cost. In Istanbul, power begins to look permanent. The city hums with the noise of commerce and administration. Ships creak at dock. The smell of fish and salt mixes with spices and smoke from charcoal braziers. Artisans hammer brass, stitch leather, weave cloth. In Topkapi, the Sultan's presence becomes a ceremony can make him seem distant, almost divine. That distance helps him rule, but it also isolates him. A man behind layers of protocol hears less truth with each passing year. Now we have to talk about the women's world because it is not separate from power. It is one of the engines of power. Roxolana enters the story not as a romantic figure, but as an event. She arrives as a captive taken by Crimean Tatar. Raiders sold in Istanbul, forced to convert, and absorbed into the sexual economy of the palace. This is the brutal foundation. The harem does not begin as an exotic fantasy. It begins as a system that turns human beings into property. And yet, inside that system, Roxolana finds leverage. She becomes Harem Sultan, and she does something unusual. She becomes Solon's wife, not merely a concubine. And she uses influence with a precision that terrifies the people around her. The harem is silent on purpose. It trains its inhabitants to communicate through glances, gifts, rumors, and small alliances. A door opening at the wrong hour can mean a death sentence. A servant who lingers can carry a secret to the wrong ear. The air feels still, but under that stillness lives a constant calculation. Hurrim understands the math of succession. She understands that her children's survival depends on which prince wins. She understands that the law and custom of dynastic struggle can kill brothers, nephews, even sons. The state wants a single ruler, and it has proven many times that it will accept family blood to ensure that outcome. Solomon's greatest strength is also his most corrosive weakness. He sits at the center of a system that demands clarity and stability, and that system teaches him to fear the people closest to him. His son Mustafa becomes the focus of that fear. By 1553, Mustafa has become a magnet for dissection in Anatolia. People gather around him because they think the old sultan is aging and the prince represents vigor and a different future. Sulan reads that support and hears a threat. The moment arrives in the military camp, not in a courtroom. Mustafa enters his father's space, expecting an audience. He walks toward the tent at the center under the gaze of men who do not blink. The smell of horses and sweat hangs in the air. Somewhere nearby, a kettle boils. Somewhere else, a soldier sharpens a blade because war makes everyone prepare for the worst. Solman orders Mustafa executed. The prince dies because the state cannot tolerate a rival center of loyalty, and because the court has trained the sultan to interpret popularity as sedition. This is not just tragedy. It is policy eating its own future. The dynasty's method of survival demands that it amputate promising limbs to keep the body alive. In the short term, it works. In the long term, it leaves the empire ruled by the survivors of palace suspicion, not necessarily the best of the bloodline. After Mustafa's death, the succession struggle turns inward among Suleiman's remaining sons. From 1559 to 1561, Selim and Bezid fight over the future, and the conflict ends with Bezid's defeat and execution. The palace watches its own children become enemies because the throne does not accept brothers. It accepts one. Everything else becomes dangerous excess. While this family catastrophe unfolds, the empire continues to fight on multiple fronts, as if the state itself cannot stop moving, even when the man at the center bleeds privately. In the Mediterranean, Ottoman power takes on a different face, one that smells of salt water and tar. Herodin Barbarossa, a corsair turned admiral, becomes the sultan's instrument at sea. His galleys move with oars, not just wind, and that matters in coastal waters where maneuverability decides life and death. At Provessa in 1538, Barbarossa defeats a combined Christian fleet and secures Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean for decades. Imagine the battle. The sea slaps against hulls. Rowers strain, backs slick with sweat, hands raw. Archers and gunners shout over the crash of waves. Smoke drifts across the water and stings eyes. A sail tears. A mast splinters. Men fall overboard and vanish, swallowed by the same water that carried them to war. Naval combat is intimate in its brutality. Fire spreads fast on wood. Panic spreads faster. The empire at Sulan's height looks unstoppable because it can strike by land and sea, because it can replace losses, because it can feed armies with an administrative system that keeps money and grain moving. But the empire also begins to show the hidden cost of its greatest innovations. The Devsham system and the Janissaries have produced soldiers of remarkable discipline. Solman relies on them, and his predecessors relied on them, and every campaign proves their value. Yet every time a sultan leans on them, he increases their sense of entitlement. An elite corps that once existed to serve the throne begins to understand that the throne also serves its needs. A janissary who knows he can make or unmake a ruler carries himself differently. He expects gifts. He expects privileges. He expects his voice to matter. The empire's sharpest blade begins to demand a hand on the hilt. The same pattern repeats with the bureaucracy. The cannon gives the state a skeleton, but it also creates officials who can run the machine while the sultan withdraws behind ceremony. That looks efficient. It also tempts future rulers to become spectators. A sultan who allows others to govern for him may keep peace in the palace, but he also trains the government to function without his direct attention. Eventually, the state begins to treat the ruler as a symbol rather than a driver. Sulian does not fully become that symbol. He campaigns repeatedly. He maintains a personal image of leadership. Yet even he cannot escape time. In 1566, he goes on campaign again, moving toward the fortress of Sigurdsfar in Hungary. He is old now. The weight of armor and travel presses harder. Illness creeps closer. He dies of natural causes during the siege. Think of the scene. A tent at night, canvas snapping softly in wind. A lamp sputters. Outside, the army waits, still believing the Sultan commands them. Inside, the man who once terrified Europe with his presence in the field lies still, and the court faces a familiar emergency. A ruler's death can dissolve an army's confidence. It can invite rebellion. It can invite enemy attack. So, the inner circle keeps the news quiet long enough to manage succession and maintain control. With Sulan's death, a myth begins to form almost immediately. Europe calls him the Magnificent. The Ottomans call him the Lawgiver. Both names tell the same story from different angles. He expanded territory and he organized rule. He made the empire look like a machine built to outlast any one person. But if you look closely, you can see the price stamped into the metal. His reign brings the empire to a peak, and his reign also reveals how that peak can become a trap. Expansion demands constant campaigning. Constant campaigning demands money and reliable troops. Reliable troops gain privileges. Privileges harden into political power. Meanwhile, the palace system that protects the throne also poisons the dynasty, forcing fathers to fear sons and turning the inner court into a contest of survival. The empire at Sulan's peak feels like a grand structure rising above the sea. Stone and marble and silk and cannon smoke. Yet inside the walls, the same forces that built it are already creating future cracks. The janissaries learn their worth. The bureaucracy grows confident. The harem grows influential. The succession rules turn family love into suspicion. And now the question that hangs over the entire Ottoman story begins to sharpen. If the empire depends on a ruler who can ride at the head of armies and command fear and loyalty at once, what happens when the throne passes to men who prefer the quiet rooms of the palace and the soft certainty of routine? Solomon dies and the empire does not collapse. That is the first deception. When a great ruler vanishes, people expect the roof to fall in. Instead, the machine keeps running. Couriers still ride out at dawn. Taxes still arrive in sacks that smell of sweat and dust. The call to prayer still climbs into the morning air over Istanbul. The Janissaries still drill, boots striking stone in unison, faces set like carved wood. The empire looks steady enough that a careless observer could mistake survival for health. But step inside the palace and listen closely. The sound changes. In Sulian's time, the court still expected the sultan to ride, to sweat under armor, to command men in the field, to push his own body against distance and weather. After him, the center of power begins to shift behind walls into rooms where silk and whisper replace mud and cannon smoke. That shift does not happen overnight, and it does not happen for a single reason. It happens because the empire has grown so large that the throne begins to fear itself. A ruler who leaves the capital for too long invites conspiracy. A prince who shows talent invites suspicion. A military corps that knows it can topple ministers begins to speak with a louder voice. So the empire continues, but the tone changes from conquest to maintenance, from hunger for new territory to anxiety about keeping what already exists. Selim II inherits the throne in 1566, and men at court take stock of what kind of master he will be. They watch the way he holds his cup. They watch whether he rises early. They watch whether he listens to petitions or waves them away. They watch the tilt of his mouth when a messenger reports trouble on the border. Selim does not carry his father's appetite for marching. He prefers the softer gravity of the palace. In the evenings, oil lamps paint gold across tiled walls. The smell of warmed wine and spiced sweets sits heavy in the air. Courtiers laugh a little too loudly, the kind of laughter that tries to prove loyalty. Outside, the Bosphorus breathes cold salt into the night, and the city below keeps working because it must. This is where another deception forms. A sultan can appear weak, and the empire can still win wars, because the empire has something Selim relies on: administrators, generals, and above all, the Janissary. The state can fight with its own muscles, even if the head grows distracted. Then the sea delivers a shock in 1571 at Leontu. The Ottoman fleet meets a coalition of Christian powers. The battle is not an elegant chess match of sails. It is choking smoke and splintering wood. Cannons roar at close range, and the sound hits the chest like a punch. GS crash into each other with the violence of street brawls. Men throw hooks, climb, stab, and fall into water that tastes of salt and blood. Fire spreads fast on tread planks. A ship becomes a floating furnace in minutes. By the time the shouting dies, the Ottoman fleet has suffered a major defeat. The empire absorbs that loss and refuses to admit what it means. Officials in Istanbul speak of rebuilding. They count ship timber and order more oars. They talk about replacement as if replacement erases humiliation. In a practical sense, they are right. The Ottomans can build ships. They can recruit rowers. They can fund a navy. But a battle like Leontu leaves a scar that does not show on a balance sheet. It teaches enemies that the Ottomans can bleed at sea. It teaches allies to question Ottoman invincibility. It teaches Ottoman commanders that the horizon contains more danger than opportunity. Inside the palace, silk still slides across shoulders. Captains embroidered with gold thread catch lamplight and make men appear larger than their courage. The sultan's seals still press into wax. But the empire has started to meet a new kind of resistance. Resistance that does not always come from a weaker neighbor begging to be conquered, but from coalitions, from technology, and from rival states that have learned how to coordinate their fear into strategy. Salem dies in 1574, and the throne passes to Murad. 3. He rules from behind the palace walls, and the walls grow thicker in meaning. Murad's court feels like a chamber where oxygen gets used up quickly. The harem expands its influence, not because women suddenly gain magical power, but because proximity matters. The Sultan spends his most vulnerable hours inside those rooms where guards stand outside doors and whispers can travel farther than proclamations. You can feel the harem's silence as something deliberate. It is not peace, it is control. Footsteps soften on carpets. Servants learn to breathe quietly. A cup set down too hard becomes a mistake someone remembers. In that quiet alliances form. Mothers fight for sons. Eunuchs carry messages and shape access. A glance from the right person can mean a position. A rumor can mean an execution. Outside those walls, a different noise grows louder. Silver floods into Europe from overseas, and prices rise across the Ottoman world. Bread that once cost a small coin begins to demand more. A soldier's pay buys less. A peasant feels squeezed not only by taxes, but by a market that seems to punish him for simply being alive. The Ottoman state needs money to fight wars and keep a vast administration fed. It leans harder on its provinces. It sells offices. It tolerates corruption. When corruption greases the gears, officials who once feared punishment begin to assume they can buy their way out of trouble. Here comes an irony that will shape the next century. The empire built its strength on disciplined institutions, especially the janissaries and the central bureaucracy. Now those institutions begin to protect their own interests as fiercely as they once protected the Sultan. The janissaries in particular change slowly at first, then all at once. They start as an elite corps, recruited and trained to serve the throne alone. They turn into a powerful social class. They marry. They run businesses. They bargain for privileges. They learn that a riot can force the palace to listen. This change matters because the Ottomans created the janissaries to solve a problem. They needed loyal troops who would not side with provincial nobles. That solution works for generations. Then the solution becomes the problem. A core designed to prevent divided loyalty becomes a core with its own loyalties, its own networks, and its own demands. On paper, the empire still looks strong. It still fields large armies. It still collects revenue. It still appoints governors. But if you stand in a coffee house and listen to the talk, you can hear a shift in confidence. Men complain about prices, about officials, about soldiers who act like kings in their neighborhoods. Coffee itself spreads through the empire as a new habit, and coffee houses become places where rumors travel faster than official decrees. A state that learned to fear conspiracies now faces something it cannot fully police: conversation. War continues because war rarely stops just because a society feels tired. The Ottomans fight the Safavids again. They fight in the Caucasus and eastern Anatolia, in regions where winter bites hard and supply lines stretch thin. A campaign there means men chewing tough bread with cracked lips, hands numb as they try to load weapons, horses slipping on frozen ground. It means commanders watching the sky and praying for roads that do not turn into rivers of mud. It means villagers caught between armies, forced to feed one side today and punished by the other tomorrow. At the same time, conflict flares on the western frontier in what becomes a long war with the Habsburgs. The borderlands of Hungary and Croatia become a scar of forts, raids, and sieges. The fighting does not always produce glorious, decisive battles. It produces exhaustion. It produces wounded men who limp back to towns where their pay cannot buy enough bread. It produces bureaucrats who scrape coin from provinces and call it necessity. It produces soldiers who begin to believe the state owes them more than gratitude. Murad dies in 1595, and Mehmed III takes the throne. He inherits not only wars, but the old dynastic nightmare. Succession still demands blood. The palace still fears rival princes, the way a man fears a knife held behind his back. Mehmed orders the execution of his brothers, and the number is large enough that the act becomes a symbol of how cold the system can be. The point is not the grisly detail. The point is what the policy does to the soul of governance. When a throne requires fratricide to feel safe, it trains rulers to equate mercy with danger. It also teaches the court that violence inside the family is normal, even necessary. But the empire begins to change its method of dealing with princes. The old pattern of killing rivals creates a public stain and a private horror. Over time, the palace experiments with confinement instead, keeping princes in a kind of gilded imprisonment. The result looks more humane. It also creates a different weakness. A prince raised in isolation, surrounded by silence and fear, does not learn how to command armies or negotiate with governors. He learns how to survive within a cage. When such a man becomes sultan, he brings the cage with him into government. This is how the empire begins to produce rulers who do not know their own provinces. In Anatolia, the Salali rebellions flare. Bandit leaders, disgruntled soldiers, dispossessed peasants, and local strongmen form roving forces that loot towns and burn villages. Smoke rises from orchards that once promised stability. Families hide in forests. A mother hushes her child as hoofbeats approach. These rebellions do not just reflect criminality. They reflect a pressure system breaking. War demands recruits. Inflation punishes the poor. Officials extract more. Men who cannot pay become desperate. Men who are desperate become violent. The empire fights these uprisings, but each suppression requires more force, more money, more strain. The palace responds, as it often does, by pulling inward. Ahmed I comes to the throne in 6003 as a teenager. He does not possess the seasoned authority of a conqueror. He carries the nervous energy of a boy surrounded by men who have survived too many purges to trust anyone. He faces a state that still expands its ceremonial magnificence while struggling to control its edges. He commissed the great mosque that Europeans will later call the Blue Mosque, filling the skyline with domes that look like stacked clouds. Inside, tilework gleams and light filters in with a softness that feels almost forgiving. Yet outside those walls, the empire fights, taxes, suppresses, and worries. Ahmad dies young in 1617, and the succession becomes messy. The empire begins to accept a new principle, not always choosing the son of the previous sultan, but choosing the next senior male in the dynasty. That choice can prevent immediate bloodshed. It can also create instability because it invites factions to form around different claimants. Mustafa I becomes sultan, and his mental instability becomes a matter of state. The palace tries to hide weakness the way it hides a corpse. Officials speak softly. Decisions stall. Then Mustafa is removed. Osman II takes the throne in 1618, and he tries to do something dangerous. He tries to discipline the Janissaries. Osman sees what the court tries not to admit. The Janissaries have become too powerful. They resist reforms. They demand payment. They riot when they feel insulted. Osman goes to war against Poland and suffers humiliation at Kotin in 1621, where the Ottoman army fails to achieve a clean victory, and the campaign exposes problems of coordination and discipline. Osman returns angry and determined to reform his forces. He whispers about creating a new army. The Janissaries hear. They do not wait. In 1622, they revolt and kill Osman. Picture the shock in Istanbul. A young sultan strangled like a criminal. His body carried out in secrecy. The palace corridors go quiet in the way they go quiet after violence, when people fear that even breathing too loudly might invite blame. The Janissaries prove the point in the most brutal way possible. The core that once guaranteed sultanic power now claims the right to end a sultan's life. This is the turning point that many empires cannot survive. Yet the Ottomans do survive. Again, that is the second deception. Each time the state survives a crisis, it teaches itself that it can survive any crisis. That belief becomes dangerous. Miadfa eventually rises to power and takes control in the late 1622. He responds to disorder with brutality that feels like an iron clamp. He bans coffee and tobacco at points, not because he hates pleasure, but because he fears gathering places and loose talk. He walks the streets in disguise, hunting corruption and disobedience. He executes officials and offenders in public. Fear becomes a tool of governance. The smell of blood and the sting of punishment become part of civic life. People lower their voices. They lock doors earlier. They think twice before complaining. Murad also fights, and he achieves something that looks like restored strength. He retakes Baghdad in 1638 after a hard campaign against the Safavids. The siege brings cannon, smoke, and hunger. Soldiers dig trenches and build batteries. The air tastes like ash. When the city finally falls, Murad reasserts Ottoman authority in the east and crafts an image of a ruler who can still win. The empire cheers because people crave competence even when it comes with terror. Murad dies in 1640 and the empire swings again. Ibrahim takes the throne and his rule becomes tangled in court faction and personal instability. The palace becomes a pressure cooker. Money leaks. Officials jostle. The harem plays politics as survival. Eventually, Ibrahim falls, executed in 1648. The pattern repeats. Confinement produces rulers who struggle with power, and the state pays the bill. Mehmed IV comes to the throne as a child in 1648. And now the empire faces a problem that cannot be solved by a sultan's personal vigor. The state needs competent management. It finds it in the Grand Vizier in the Kopu family. Köprülü, Mehmed Pasha becomes Grand Vizier in 1656 and restores order with a familiar Ottoman method: purge, discipline, and relentless enforcement. He removes rivals. He punishes corruption. He reasserts the center. His son, Kupru Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, follows and continues the program. The empire begins to win again. Not because the Sultan is a conqueror, but because the Viziers run the machine with ruthless competence. This raises an unsettling question. If the empire can function under strong ministers while the Sultan remains distant, what exactly is the Sultan now? A driver or a symbol? War with Venice over Crete drags on for years and ends with the Ottoman conquest of Candia in 1669 after one of the longest sieges of the early modern world. The siege consumes lives in slow motion. Disease kills as effectively as cannon. The air in the trenches grows sour. Men live in mud and filth. They breathe smoke day after day until their lungs feel coated. When the fortress finally yields, the victory tastes bitter because it took so much to chew through stone. Yet victory encourages ambition, and ambition can blind. By the 1672 seconds and early 1680 seconds, Ottoman leadership looks again towards Central Europe. The borderlands have long been a zone of raids and politics, and now the court sees an opening. Internal problems in Hungary and rivalry among European powers suggest a moment to strike. Grand Vizier Mustafa Pasha becomes the man at the center of this gamble. He wants glory. He wants to stamp his name into history the way the conquerors did. He believes Vienna can fall. In 1683, the Ottoman army marches toward Vienna again. This time, the empire brings experience, artillery, and the confidence of recent successes. But the march still grinds through distance and logistics. Men trudge under heavy packs. Horses strain. Supplies move slowly. The army arrives and digs in. Now you are back in the mud. The trenches outside Vienna fill with cold water. Boots sink. Men scoop mud with hands numb from wind. Cannon smoke hangs low in the air, mixing with the smell of damp earth, sweating bodies, and rotting food. Each day begins with hammering, digging, praying. Each night brings exhaustion and the sharp fear that a counterattack might come in darkness. Inside Vienna, the defenders brace and ration. They listen for mining under the walls. They smell smoke and fear in crowded streets. The city becomes a stomach tightening around itself. Mustafa presses the siege, and here ambition begins to show its teeth. He wants Vienna intact, not smashed to rubble, because an intact capital would make a better trophy and a stronger political prize. That desire slows decisions. It affects how he uses artillery. It shapes his timing. Meanwhile, Europe organizes relief. A coalition forms. Men who do not love each other decide they hate the Ottomans more. The relief army arrives, and on the 12th of September 1683, the battle explodes on the hills above Vienna. Cavalry charges down slopes. Infantry fires in volleys. Cannons cough, smoke and flame. The Ottomans fight hard, but they cannot hold. The siege collapses into retreat. The dream of Vienna dies again, not with a single dramatic sword thrust, but with the messy unraveling of logistics, coalition, warfare, and overreach. The retreat becomes a humiliation. Supplies get abandoned. Soldiers scatter. Fear runs faster than discipline. And back in Istanbul, the court demands a scapegoat because empires hate admitting structural failure. Kara Mustafa pays for defeat with his life. They strangle him, and the silk cord tightens like a moral verdict. This is the moment when the empire's long turning begins to feel irreversible. Not because Vienna alone breaks it, but because Vienna exposes what has been building for generations. The Janissaries have grown into a force that can kill sultans. Succession practices have produced rulers who know the palace better than the provinces. Court factions have learned to survive through intrigue rather than competence. Inflation and war have strained the economy and provoked rebellion. The empire still has strength, still has wealth, still has men who can administer and fight, but it has also developed habits that eat away at its ability to adapt quickly. Its greatest strengths have begun to demand tribute from the future. The Ottoman army crawls away from Vienna in 1683, like a wounded animal that still has teeth but no longer believes in its own roar. The roads turn slick under hoof and wheel. Rain mixes with churned soil until the ground becomes a thick paste that tugs at boots and swallows dropped muskets. Men glance over their shoulders as if the hills themselves have learned how to hunt. A few weeks earlier, they had dug trenches with the confidence of a power that assumed the city would eventually surrender. Now they abandoned tents, barrels, even artillery pieces, because fear moves faster than discipline. The smoke of their own campfires trails behind them like a confession. Back in Istanbul, the palace demands an explanation that fits on a single sheet of paper. Empires hate complicated truths. Kara Mustafa aimed too high, they say. He mismanaged the siege, they say. He failed the Sultan, they say. And so they tighten a silk cord around his neck and call it justice. The silk feels smooth, almost gentle, which is its own kind of cruelty. The court does not fix the deeper problem. It only reassures the court that someone paid. Now the real reckoning arrives. Not in one dramatic battle, but in years of losing ground in slow motion. After Vienna, the empire meets a new kind of pressure. European states do not simply resist. They coordinate. They study Ottoman methods, copy Ottoman artillery practices, modernize their armies, and form alliances that turn the Ottomans from a storm into a target. The war that follows drags through the late 17th century. Fortresses change hands, villages burn, fields get trampled into mud, and then, in 1699, the empire signs the Treaty of Karowitz, and the ink dries like a bruise. The Ottomans cede large territories in Central Europe, including much of Hungary, and the psychological shift is immediate. The empire has spent centuries expanding. Now it begins negotiating retreats. You can feel what this does to a political system built on conquest. Conquest had been the empire's proof of divine favor and administrative competence. It justified taxes, recruitment, and sacrifice. It fed the janissaries with prizes and allowed the palace to hand out governorships like rewards. When expansion slows, the whole arrangement starts to creak. The empire still collects taxes, still appoints officials, still dazzles visitors with domes and tiled courtyards, but it cannot offer the same easy promise that tomorrow will bring new territory, new wealth, new glory. So the court turns inward, and the inward turn has a smell. In Topkapi, you can almost taste the change in the air. More perfume, more ceremony, more layers of fabric between the ruler and the world. Silk coffins glide through corridors that absorb sound. Courtiers lower their voices instinctively. A sultan's presence becomes more rare, more staged, more wrapped in ritual. The harem's silence grows heavier, not because nothing happens there, but because too much happens there to be spoken aloud. A mother watches her son sleep and measures every breath as if it might be borrowed. A eunuch carries a folded note inside his sleeve like it is a weapon. A servant learns to set a cup down without a sound because a sound can be interpreted as disrespect, and disrespect can become a pretext. Outside the palace walls, a different reality presses in. Prices rise, pay lags. Merchants complain about officials who demand extra fees at checkpoints. A farmer watches his grain leave the barn and knows his family will eat less this winter. War takes men away from fields. War also takes coin away from local markets. When the state needs money quickly, it leans harder on tax farming. Powerful men buy the right to collect taxes, then squeeze harder to turn a profit. The empire's administration remains sophisticated, but sophistication does not guarantee fairness. It can actually make exploitation more efficient. This is where the janissaries begin to matter in a new way. They once represented discipline and fearlessness, a corps that marched at the sultan's command and broke enemy lines without hesitation. Now they become a political constituency. They do not behave like soldiers who exist to serve. They behave like men who believe the state owes them a living. They open shops. They marry. They build local networks. They demand bonuses and resist reforms. When they riot, the sound of their anger echoes off the city stone like a warning to the throne. The very institution created to prevent divided loyalty now embodies divided loyalty. The core becomes loyal to its own privileges. First, the empire tries to correct course by leaning on strong ministers and occasional energetic rulers. But the deeper issue remains. The Ottoman state had grown so successful that it developed habits built for a world where it could dictate terms. Now it must survive in a world where others dictate them back. In 1718, the empire signs the Treaty of Passarowitz. After another war that ends badly, more territory slips away. The court responds in a way that feels almost human, like a person coping with stress by throwing a party. The so-called tulip era arrives, and it looks like beauty at first glance. Gardens glow with lanterns at night. Fountains murmur. Tulips stand upright in neat beds, their colors lit by flickering oil lamps. Men of the court wear fine cloth and discuss poetry, architecture, and European fashions. The air smells of sweet pastries and rosewater. Coffee steams in small cups, dark and bitter, and conversation flows more freely than the palace would like. But beneath the elegance sits a sharp resentment. The empire's common people do not live in lantern light and tulip gardens. They live under rising prices and uneven justice. They watch officials spend lavishly, while soldiers demand extra pay. They listen to rumors that the court has lost its toughness. They see foreign ambassadors strolling through Istanbul with a confidence that would have been unthinkable under sultans. They feel the empire's pride thinning. Then, in 1730, rage breaks through the silt. A revolt erupts, led by men who speak for the anger in the streets. They storm through the city and force the sultan to abdicate. The tulip era ends not with a polite fade, but with violence and humiliation. The palace learns a brutal lesson. If the court looks too detached, the city will remind it who is hungry. If the sultan cannot command respect, a mob can command fear. And still, the empire does not die. It adapts, but in ways that create new problems later. One of the most important shifts happens quietly in the provinces. Local notables, provincial power brokers, and regional governors begin to act with growing independence. They raise troops, collect taxes, negotiate with neighbors, sometimes ignore orders. The palace needs their cooperation to keep the empire stable, especially when the central army struggles to mobilize quickly. So, the court bargains with them. It grants privileges. It recognizes their authority informally, then formally, then permanently. The empire holds together, but the glue becomes personal deals rather than unquestioned central command. Here is another irony. Decentralization can keep an empire from snapping in a crisis because local strongmen can handle local problems quickly. But the same decentralization also makes later reform harder, because every local strongman becomes a small fortress of sub. Meanwhile, the world beyond the empire changes its economic rhythm. Trade routes shift. European powers expand maritime commerce and build global networks that bypass older routes. Merchants in Ottoman ports feel the difference. A dock worker in Alexandria or Smyrna hears foreign languages more often. A customs official watches goods move under European flags and realizes that profits increasingly flow outward. The empire still has wealth, but it no longer sits at the center of the world's most profitable motion. The state's expenses do not shrink just because global trade patterns shift. War still costs money. Fortresses still need garrisons. Officials still demand salaries. So, the empire must find new revenue or squeeze harder. Squeezing harder creates rebellion. Rebellion demands force. Force costs money. It becomes a circle that tightens. In the 18th century, the empire faces two relentless predators on land, Russia and Austria. Russia, in particular, presses south with a hunger that feels almost personal. Russian rulers dream of warm water ports and influence in the Black Sea. They also claim a role as protectors of Orthodox Christians, a claim that becomes a diplomatic knife aimed at Ottoman sovereignty. Every time the Ottomans fight Russia, they fight not only armies, but also a story Russia tells about legitimacy. The war's grind. Winter campaigns freeze men in their boots. Cannon smoke hangs low in cold air. Horses slip on icy roads. A soldier grips a musket with numb fingers and prays it fires. When battles end, disease keeps killing. Field hospitals stink of sweat, blood, and sour linen. Doctors work with saws and cloth, and the screams travel through tents like a second wind. In 1774, after another punishing conflict, the empire signs the Treaty of Kuchak-Kanaka, and it lands like a punch to the ribs. The Ottomans give up key positions and accept terms that strengthen Russian influence, including claims tied to Orthodox Christians. The empire has not only lost territory and prestige, it has accepted a foreign power's right to speak into its internal affairs. That kind of concession does not show up in a parade route, but it changes the future. Now the phrase people will later use begins to form in the minds of European diplomats. They start talking about the Ottoman Empire as a weakening entity, something that will eventually be divided. The empire becomes an object of calculation. Inside Istanbul, this talk produces two reactions that clash like flint and steel. One reaction is denial. The court clings to ceremony. It doubles down on tradition. It insists that the old order remains strong because admitting weakness feels like inviting collapse. The other reaction is reform, and reform begins as fear. Some Ottoman officials look at European armies and see discipline, drills, and new methods of war. They look at Russian artillery and understand that bravery will not compensate for outdated organization. They look at the Janissaries and see an elite corps that has turned into a political obstacle. They look at provincial autonomy and see a state slowly losing the ability to compel. They realize that the empire must change or it will be carved up. But changing the Ottoman state means confronting its strongest institutions, the ones that built its power in the first place. That is the deepest Ottoman irony. The empire's tools of greatness become its chains. Now the story pulls toward the end of the century and the outside world arrives with a blunt force. In 1798, Napoleon lands in Egypt. Imagine the shock traveling across the Mediterranean like a cold current. French ships appear on the horizon. Soldiers disembark with a confidence born from the French Revolution's new wars. The sand heats under their boots. The air smells of salt and dust. Cairo, with its crowded alleys and the scent of bread, animals, and river water, becomes a prize. Napoleon defeats local forces, then poses as a liberator while wielding an occupier's fist. He brings scholars and officers. He studies and conquers at the same time, turning invasion into a spectacle of modern ambition. For the Ottoman Empire, the invasion is a humiliation of a special kind. Egypt is not a remote outpost. It is one of the empire's most valuable provinces, a place of grain, revenue, and strategic position. The fact that a European army can march in and take it exposes Ottoman vulnerability in a way that diplomats in Istanbul cannot ignore. The empire does not crumble on the spot. It fights back with help from Britain and local resistance. The French eventually withdraw, but the damage remains. Egypt does not return to the neat obedience it once pretended to offer. Power has shifted. New, strong men rise. Local forces begin to act like rulers, not servants. Back in Istanbul, Sultan Selim III tries to respond like a man who understands the coming century will not forgive nostalgia. He looks at his army and sees a corpse dressed in uniforms. He knows he must build something new. So he starts the Nizam Ised, the new order. This is not simply a policy. It is a provocation. Selim brings in new training methods. He builds new units. He demands discipline. He tries to fund the reforms through new taxes and reorganized revenues. The idea sounds reasonable, even necessary. But reason does not matter if powerful groups feel threatened. The Janissaries see the new order and recognize it for what it is, an attempt to replace them. The old core does not want improvement if improvement reduces its privilege. It does not want a modern army if a modern army makes it obsolete. It wants its bonuses, its status, its ability to riot and extract concessions. Selim also faces resistance from traditional elites and provincial power holders who fear a stronger central state. Reform threatens everyone who benefits from the current disorder, so the Sultan stands on a narrow bridge over a deep drop. On one side is the modern world pressing in with rifles, bureaucracies, and alliances. On the other side is the empire's own institutional muscle built over centuries and now refusing to bend. Here is the grim truth. Reform in an empire often looks like betrayal to the people who built the empire's strength. In the palace, Selim can still wrap himself in silk and ceremony, but the silk does not protect him from the logic of power. At night, the corridors remain quiet, yet the quiet no longer feels controlled. It feels anxious. The same silence that once hid palace intrigue now hides the possibility of revolt. A guard watches a doorway and wonders whether he will be ordered to defend the Sultan or arrest him. A courtier smiles and calculates which side will win. As the century closes, the Ottoman Empire still stands. Its mosques still cast long shadows in afternoon sun. Its markets still buzz with trade. Its provinces still pay, at least on paper. But the empire's old confidence has drained away, replaced by a constant balancing act between reform and backlash. The Ottomans once created institutions that could conquer and hold territory across 3 continents. Now those institutions resist the changes needed to survive in a world where conquest has become harder and diplomacy has become sharper. The empire has not reached its final collapse yet. That comes later with revolutions, nationalism, and world war. But by 1800, the Ottoman state has already stepped into a new era where survival depends on adaptation. And adaptation requires the empire to fight itself. The Ottoman Empire crosses into the 19th century with its nerves exposed. It still looks imposing from a distance. Minarets still spear the sky above Istanbul. The Bosphorus still carries ships like a moving road of salt water. In the markets, copper pans still ring under hammer blows. Spices still stain fingers. Silk capons still whisper across palace floors. But the empire no longer trusts itself. That is the real change. It cannot trust its army. It cannot trust its provinces. It cannot even trust the men in uniform standing closest to the throne, because those men have learned how to make rulers afraid. Sultan Selim III tried to build a new army, a new order, because he could smell the future. The way sailors smell a storm before the first wave rises. He understood that the empire's enemies now drilled in squares, marched in disciplined lines, and fired in coordinated volleys. He understood that courage without organization dies quickly under modern artillery. He also understood something more humiliating. The Ottoman state, once the terror of Europe, now had to imitate Europe just to survive. That realization is poison in an imperial court. It tastes like defeat before the battle even starts. C paid for reform with his life. In 1807, the Janissaries and their allies rose and forced him from the throne. They did not need to bring foreign armies through the gates. They used the empire's own institutions against it. The palace corridors filled with sudden movement, boots on stone, the harsh metallic scrape of weapons being lifted. Men who had once bowed to Sem now looked away as if they could not bear to meet his eyes. The Janissaries did not act like servants. They acted like owners. Selim's successor, Mustafa, tried to keep order by offering concessions and clinging to tradition. But the empire was already in the kind of crisis that does not respond to politeness. In 1808, a reformist faction and provincial forces moved in to restore change. They removed Mustafa, and Mahmud II took the throne. Mahmud II is not born a conqueror, but he becomes a survivor. He understands that the Janissaries have turned into a permanent threat. He understands that reform cannot succeed as long as the most powerful armed group in the capital behaves like a cartel. He waits. He watches. He learns. Inside Topkapi, the silence of the harem and the council chambers feels more tense than before. As if the air itself holds its breath, Mahmud sees how power moves. He learns which officials whisper into which corridors. He listens to petitions and hears the same complaint in different voices. The Janissaries demand pay. The provinces resist orders. The treasury groans. The empire's borders rattle like a door in a strong wind. And then the world outside the palace starts to peel away. In 1821, Greek rebels rise. The rebellion does not begin as a neat war between uniformed armies. It begins with fear, rumor, revenge, and sudden violence in villages and ports. A priest whispers about freedom. A merchant passes a message. A young man with a knife decides he is no longer afraid. Ottoman officials respond with harshness, and harshness breeds more rebellion. The ion air smells of salt and smoke. Ships burn in harbors. Families flee into hills. In Constantinople, news arrives in pieces, carried by frightened messengers and frantic letters. The empire realizes a terrifying truth. People who have lived under Ottoman rule for centuries can now imagine leaving it. Mahmud tries to crush the revolt, but the situation escalates. European powers intervene, not out of pure idealism, but because Greece becomes a useful moral banner and a strategic pawn. In 1827, at Navarino, a combined British, French, and Russian fleet destroys the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. Cannon smoke thickens over the water, splinters fly, fire races along decks. Men jump into the sea and vanish. The Ottoman side does not just lose ships, it loses a sense of control over the Mediterranean's narrative. It learns that Europe can strike Ottoman forces directly and then justify it as civilization defending itself. Mahmud absorbs that humiliation and doubles down on what he believes is necessary. He turns his gaze inward toward the By 1826, he decides he can no longer coexist with them. He does not issue a gentle reform. He sets a trap. He announces a new modern core. The Janissaries protest. They riot. They gather with their old confidence, believing the palace will yield like it always has. Then Mahmud unleashes artillery on their barracks. The moment becomes known as the auspicious incident, a name that tries to make slaughter sound like destiny. In reality, it is smoke and screams. The cannons roar inside Istanbul. The sound echoes off domes and stone. The air fills with burnt powder and the smell of charred wood. Men run and fall. The old core that once marched as the empire's sharpest blade becomes bodies in rubble. Mahmud's troops hunt survivors. They execute leaders. They tear down symbols. The empire kills its own creation because it has no other way to survive. This is the deepest Ottoman irony rendered in fire. The institution that built Ottoman power in Europe and guarded the sultans now dies by the sultan's cannons because it has become too dangerous to keep alive. Mahmud replaces the Janissaries with a new army trained and organized along European lines. He changes clothing, forcing officials and soldiers into uniforms and eventually the fez, trying to strip away old identities and create a modern state aesthetic. Even fashion becomes policy, because in an empire appearances are not decoration. They are hierarchy made visible. But every reform produces backlash. Mahmud also faces a new threat that reveals how fragile central rule has become. In Egypt, Muhammad Ali, the Ottoman governor, builds his own power base. He modernizes his army, reforms administration, and acts like a ruler. He sees the weakness in Istanbul and decides he can extract concessions. His forces march into Syria and threaten the empire's core. Mahmud finds himself in the humiliating position of needing European diplomacy to save him from his own governor. Britain, Russia, Austria, and France maneuver, and the Ottoman Empire becomes a stage on which other powers negotiate. Mahmud dies in 1839, and the empire inherits not stability but reform momentum mixed with panic. His successor, Abdülmecid, issues the Tanzimat reforms, beginning with the Golden Edict in 1839. The document promises security of life and property, more regular taxation, and new legal principles. It reads like a promise of fairness. In practice, it is also an act of desperation. The Ottoman state is trying to convince its own subjects and foreign powers that it can become a predictable modern government, not a decaying autocracy that will collapse into chaos. You can feel the tension in the bureaucracy. Clerks scratch ink across paper, recording new categories, new rules, new systems. Cuirasses smell of wax and damp stone. Officials debate in rooms heavy with tobacco smoke. Reformers speak of law and equality. Conservatives mutter about betrayal. Provincial elites calculate whether reforms will weaken their grip or strengthen their bargaining position. The Tanzimat era is not a single decision. It is decades of struggle between two realities. Reality one is that the empire must modernize or die. Reality two is that modernization threatens every group that benefits from the old order. And while this internal fight continues, the empire faces external war. In 1853, the Crimean War erupts. Russia presses against Ottoman territories and claims a role as protector of Orthodox Christians. The Ottomans, fearing collapse, ally with Britain and France. The war becomes a brutal laboratory of modern warfare. In Crimea, mud clings to boots and turns trenches into watery graves. Soldiers shiver under rain that never seems to stop. Cannon smoke hangs over the battlefield like a dirty blanket. Disease kills more efficiently than bullets. Hospitals stink of blood, sweat, and sour linens. Nurses and doctors work with limited tools, trying to keep men alive who have already lost too much. The Ottomans fight alongside Western allies, and this is another bitter irony. The empire that once stood as Europe's terror now survives partly through European support, a support that comes with strings, loans, influence, demands. After the war, the empire leans harder into reform. The 1856 Reform Edict promises more rights and equality for non-Muslim subjects, partly to satisfy European expectations, and partly to stabilize the diverse populations within the empire. But reforms create new tensions. Muslim subjects sometimes resent changes they perceive as favoritism. Non-Muslim subjects often see reforms as inadequate or unevenly enforced. Local officials resist. The central government pushes. The result is a constant friction that generates heat, but not always progress. Meanwhile, nationalism spreads like a contagious idea. In the Balkans, communities begin to imagine themselves not as subjects of a sultan, but as nations deserving sovereignty. Serbian uprisings, Bulgarian agitation, Romanian aspirations, and Greek independence all form part of a pattern. The Ottoman Empire is trying to hold together a complex state while European powers encourage separatism when it suits them. The empire becomes a patient surrounded by doctors who argue over who gets the inheritance. In the 1870 seconds, the pressure explodes again. Bulgarian revolts and the harsh Ottoman response become a scandal in Europe, fueling interventionist sentiment. Russia seizes the moment. The Russo-Ottoman War of 1877 and 1878 brings disaster. Ottoman soldiers retreat through snow and mud. Rifles crack in cold air. Villages fill with refugees. Carts loaded with blankets. Children crying. Old men staring at the road as if it has betrayed them. Constantinople itself feels threatened. The war ends with treaties that redraw the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire loses territory and influence. It also loses moral authority in European eyes, as stories of atrocities circulate and harden stereotypes. the empire becomes isolated, and isolation breeds paranoia. Enter Abdulhamid II. He takes the throne in 1876 and inherits both reform and chaos. A constitution is proclaimed, then suspended. Abdulhamid chooses control over openness. He builds a network of surveillance and censorship. He becomes a sultan who rarely leaves his palace, ruling through papers, spies, and fear. The palace grows quiet in a different way now. Not the quiet of ceremony, but the quiet of people afraid to speak. Abdulhamid understands that the empire has become a chessboard for others. He tries to play Britain against Russia, Germany against France, promising concessions, signing deals, building railways, seeking allies. The smell of coal and metal becomes part of the empire's new face. Trains whistle through Anatolia. Telegraph wires carry messages faster than horses ever could. Modernity arrives as infrastructure, but infrastructure does not solve legitimacy. During Abdulhamid's rule, the Armenian question intensifies. Armenian communities seek reforms and protection. Kurdish tribes, local officials, and the state's security apparatus clash in escalating violence. Massacres occur in the 1890 seconds. Bloodstains, streets, and fields. Survivors carry trauma like a second skin. The empire tries to suppress dissent and maintain control. But repression fuels more resentment, and resentment fuels more fear. This is the trap of late empire. It responds to instability with violence, and violence creates more instability. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire remains on the map, but it has changed fundamentally. It has lost large portions of its European territories. It has become dependent on foreign loans and foreign diplomacy. It has built modern systems while struggling to modernize its political soul. It has tried to reform, then retreated into authoritarian control. It has killed its janissaries, the old engine of conquest, and replaced them with new armies that still struggle to match European powers. It has promised equality while enforcing hierarchy. It has relied on the old centralizing instinct while bargaining with provincial power. And through all of this, the palace still glows at night. Lantern light on water, domes reflected in the Bosphorus, silk capons still moving through corridors that hold too many secrets. The empire survives, but survival has become a kind of exhaustion. The next phase will not merely test whether the Ottomans can reform. It will test whether the empire can remain an empire at all in a world that now worships the nation-state, the mass army, and the ruthless arithmetic of industrial war. The Ottoman Empire enters the 20th century like a man walking with a hidden wound. He still wears fine clothes. He still speaks with authority. But every step hurts, and he knows the next fall might be the one that does not allow him to stand again. On a humid night in Salonika in 1908, young officers gather in rooms that smell of sweat, tobacco, and cheap ink. They whisper over folded papers and half-eaten bread. Some wear uniforms that fit too tightly at the shoulders, as if the empire itself has outgrown its old skin. They speak of the Constitution like it is a weapon, not a document. They speak of Abdulhamid II as a spider at the center of a web of spies. They do not laugh much. They have learned that words can cost you your life. Abdulhamid rules from a place of fear and calculation. His palace feels less like a home and more like a bunker dressed in velvet. The silence in his inner rooms has a taste, dry and metallic, like fear held too long in the mouth. He trusts paper more than people. He trusts reports more than friends. He believes that if he loosens his grip, the empire will shatter. He may be right. He may also be the one making it shatter faster. For decades, he has used censorship and surveillance to hold the state together. He has also played Europe's powers against one another, bargaining to keep the empire alive. But bargaining requires leverage, and leverage weakens with every lost province, every foreign loan, every treaty signed with a pen that feels heavier than a sword. The Young Turks understand something simple. If they wait, the empire will die on someone else's schedule. So they move. The revolution of 198 forces, the restoration of the constitution. The streets fill with cheers, not only in the cities, but in provincial towns where men have never seen. Istanbul's palaces and still feel the weight of its taxes. Crowds shout for liberty. Soldiers embrace civilians. For a moment, the air tastes like possibility, but possibility comes with a shadow. The Young Turks, organized around the Committee of Union and Progress, do not merely want freedom. They want control. They believe the empire can survive only if it becomes centralized, disciplined, and loyal to a single national idea. They inherit a state built on managing difference through hierarchy and negotiation, and they begin to favor a harder approach. They speak of unity, and unity in a crumbling empire often means forcing everyone to fit a shape they did not choose. The counter-revolution arrives quickly in 1909. Reactionary forces revolt in Istanbul. The city's sound changes overnight. You hear shouts in narrow streets and the sudden crack of rifles. You smell smoke and damp stone. Barracks empty. Men run. Fear spreads faster than reason. The Young Turk forces march from Salana to Istanbul and crush the uprising. They depose Abdulhamid and send him away. An old sultan reduced to a guarded passenger, his empire leaving him behind. The palace has seen coups before, Janissary revolts before, strangled sultans before, but this feels different. The state now belongs to men who think in terms of committees, programs, and national survival. They do not dream in the old imperial language of conquest and ceremony. They dream in the new language of crisis management and control. Then the empire starts losing pieces faster, like ice breaking off a riverbank in spring. In 1911, Italy attacks Ottoman Libya. The empire, already strained, cannot defend a distant province effectively. Young officers go to fight there anyway, including men who will soon become central figures. They move through deserts that taste of grit and heat. They sweat under wool uniforms. They learn guerrilla tactics because they lack naval power and resources. The war ends with the Ottomans giving up Libya. The loss looks small on a map compared to earlier eras, but it carries a message. European powers can now strip Ottoman territory without fearing a serious Ottoman response. Then the Balkan Wars arrive in 1912 and 1913. like a knife pressed to the empire's throat. Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro attack. Ottoman forces, poorly coordinated and exhausted, crumble. Towns that had lived under Ottoman rule for centuries suddenly fly new flags. Refugees flood toward Istanbul. They arrive with carts, bundles, and haunted faces. Children cry from hunger and cold. Old men stare at the ground as if it has betrayed them. The roads fill with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and panic. Adrianople, Edirne, the old Ottoman capital, becomes a symbol of humiliation when it falls. The empire that once threatened Vienna now fights to keep the outskirts of its own heartland. Even when the Ottomans recover a DNA during the Second Balkan War, the psychological damage remains. The Balkans, long a core arena of Ottoman identity and revenue, slip away. This is not only a strategic loss, it is a wound to memory. In Istanbul, the young Turk leadership responds with urgency and ruthlessness. The coup of 1913, led by figures like Invasina, pushes the empire into a more openly authoritarian direction. The empire now sits in the hands of men who believe that hesitation is death. They look at the map shrinking and they decide that survival requires drastic action. And here the tragedy tightens, because the empire is no longer simply a state defending borders. It becomes a desperate patient willing to accept increasingly dangerous medicine. European powers watch the Ottoman decline like creditors watching a debtor. They talk about reforms and protections for minorities, but they also talk about ports, rail lines, and influence. Russia presses from the north with the old dream of controlling the straits. Britain cares about routes to India and oil. France eyes influence in the Levant. Germany offers partnership, weapons, advisors, and the promise of respect. The Ottoman leadership chooses Germany. It is a decision born from fear and ambition. They believe a strong alliance can prevent the empire from being carved up. They believe war might even allow them to recover lost territories. They also believe, with a gambler's faith, that the future belongs to bold men. In late 1914, the empire enters the First World War. The decision does not come with a dramatic public confession. It arrives through a chain of actions, naval maneuvers, and political calculations. Then suddenly, the empire is at war with powers that have larger economies, global resources, and armies that draw from industrial systems. War changes the smell of a society. In Istanbul, coal smoke thickens as the city strains to supply the front. Bread becomes smaller. Prices rise. Women wait in lines with baskets. Officials issue ration cards and make promises they cannot always keep. In the palace, silk still moves through corridors, but the silk now feels like a costume worn during a fire. The empire fights on multiple fronts at once, and each front becomes a different kind of nightmare. In the Caucasus, Invasir dreams of glory. He dreams of a bold winter offensive that will crush Russian forces and open a path to Turk lands beyond. In late 1914 and early 1915, he drives troops into mountains under snow. The cold does not feel like weather. It feels like an enemy that slips inside your clothes and claws at your bones. Men march with frozen beards and cracked lips. They sleep in drifts and wake up stiff, if they wake up at all. Boots fill with ice. Rifles jam. Horses collapse. The campaign ends in catastrophe as thousands die, many from exposure. The empire learns again that ambition can kill more surely than bullets. In Mesopotamia, Ottoman troops fight British forces moving toward Baghdad. The region is a different torture. Heat presses down like a hand on the skull. Flies swarm around wounds. Water tastes of mud. At Kut, Ottoman forces besiege and force the surrender of a British Indian army in 1916. The victory gives the empire a brief surge of pride. Then the war continues, grinding on until British forces take Baghdad in 1917. The empire bleeds men it cannot replace easily. Then comes Gallipoli in 1915, a battle that becomes myth for multiple nations. The Allies aim to force the Dardanelles, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a route to Russia. They land on steep shores under fire. The sea is cold. The air reeks of salt and cordite. Bullets crack like snapped branches. Men slip on wet rocks and fall into water-stained red. The trenches form quickly and then deepen into a world of mud, lice, and constant fear. The stench of decomposing bodies lingers because the dead lie too close to the living for comfort and too many for proper burial. Ottoman defenders, including officers like Mustafa Kemal, hold the lines with brutal determination. They do not fight with romantic zeal. They fight because retreat means the enemy reaches Istanbul. They fight because commanders shout and because fear can focus the mind into a narrow tunnel. They fight until the ground itself looks shredded. When the Allies withdraw in late 1915 and early 1916, the Ottomans claim a major victory. The empire celebrates. For a moment, it believes it has proven it still has life. But that victory does not change the deeper math. The empire has fewer resources than its enemies. It fights a war of attrition with a fragile economy. It also faces internal pressures that war amplifies. This is where the story turns darker. And it must, because the empire's end is not only a military defeat, it is also a moral collapse. In 1915, Ottoman authorities begin mass deportations of Armenians from eastern Anatolia and other regions, framing it as a security measure in wartime. What follows is a catastrophe. Deportation columns move along roads under guard. People stumble through dust and heat. Hunger strips bodies down quickly. Children cry until they cannot. Women carry what they can and then drop it when their arms fail. Bandits attack. Some officials abuse their power. Disease spreads. Large numbers die through killing, starvation, and exhaustion. Entire communities vanish. The roads become a trail of loss the survivors remember as a smell. Dust mixed with sweat and blood. You cannot separate this from the empire's logic of desperation. The leadership believes enemies surround them and betrayal hides in every minority community. They respond with harshness that becomes annihilation. The state that once managed diversity through negotiated hierarchy now uses violence to solve what it sees as a security problem. It is one of the most terrible ironies of late Ottoman rule. In trying to save the state, it destroys parts of its own population and stains its legacy with an enduring horror. Meanwhile, in the Arab provinces, the empire faces another kind of unraveling. Arab elites have long served the empire, negotiated within it, and resented it at times. War intensifies those tensions. British agents promise support for Arab revolt. Local leaders calculate their chances. In 1916, the Arab revolt begins, and the Hijaz Railway becomes both artery and target. Saboteurs tear up tracks. Trains derail. Ottoman troops guard stations under the desert sun. Sand gets into everything, into food, into guns, into eyes. Water becomes a constant worry. The desert is quiet in a way that feels like being watched. The empire tries to hold the Levant to Rabia. It still has competent commanders. It still has loyal troops, but it fights while the ground shifts beneath it. Loyalty becomes conditional. Hunger becomes political. Britain advances through Palestine with fresh supplies and growing momentum. Ottoman lines stretch thin. Damascus, a city of markets and old stones, eventually falls in 1918. The news hits Istanbul with a cold weight. By 1918, the empire is exhausted. In the capital, people speak of shortages and funerals. They speak of sons who never returned. They speak of officials who still live well, while ordinary families eat less. The smell of soup grows thinner. Coal becomes precious. In the palace, the rituals continue, but the rituals now feel like a performance staged for an audience that has already left. In October 1918, the empire signs the Armistice of Mut. The war ends, but peace does not arrive. Instead, occupation arrives. Allied ships enter the Bosphorus. You can picture them in the grey light. Steel hulls cutting through water that once carried sultans and admirals. The sight has a particular humiliation. Istanbul, the city taken by cannon in 1453, now hosts foreign forces without a final battle at its gates. Ottoman soldiers watch from the shore. Civilians stare. Some feel anger. Some feel numbness. The empire has survived sieges, rebellions, and wars for centuries. Now it faces the quiet violence of being controlled. The Sultan Mehmed VI sits on a throne that feels like a chair placed on a collapsing floor. He hopes that cooperation with the Allies might preserve the dynasty. He sends diplomats. He signs documents. He tries to appear reasonable. But reason does not matter to powers that smell blood. In 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres proposes to partition Ottoman territory. It envisions zones of influence, mandates, and new states. It strips the empire down to a core. Too many Turks. It reads like a death certificate that someone else wrote. Here the empire's final irony reaches a cruel clarity. For centuries, the Ottoman state maintained itself through centralized authority and military discipline. It punished rebels and demanded obedience. Now, in its last phase, it loses control in the capital, and the resistance that emerges does not fight for the empire as it once existed. It fights for something new. Mustafa Kemal steps forward in 1919. He travels to Samsun officially to oversee order, and he begins organizing resistance instead. The move is both political and psychological. It tells people that the future will not be decided in occupied Istanbul, but in Anatolia, where the ground is still under Turkish control and where local support can become an army. Ankara becomes the center of a new legitimacy. Meetings take place in rooms that smell of wood, smoke, and damp cloth. Men argue over maps on tables scarred by knives. They talk about sovereignty and national survival with the urgency of people who have watched their world shrink. They send messages through couriers who ride on poor roads, dodging patrols. They collect weapons quietly, sometimes stolen, sometimes bought, sometimes surrendered by units that prefer a Turkish future to a sultan who signs away their home. The old Ottoman system begins to split. In Istanbul, the sultan remains. In Ankara, the national movement grows. The empire's tradition of central authority now competes with a new central authority, one born out of rebellion against the old center. The state faces a civil fracture at the exact moment it faces foreign occupation. War follows. Greek forces, encouraged by Allied support, push into western Anatolia. Villages burn. Civilians flee. The smell of smoke becomes a constant presence. Men who once served the Ottoman army now serve the national movement. They fight with old rifles and new desperation. Battles at İnönü in 1921 helped steady morale for the nationalist side. Later, at Sakarya in 1921, the fighting becomes a brutal test of endurance. The front stretches across harsh ground. Men dig in. Dust coats their teeth. Water runs low. Artillery thumps day after day, and the air feels permanently bruised by sound. Mustafa Kemal's forces hold, and the line does not break. The war is not only a contest of armies, it is a contest of legitimacy. The national movement claims it represents the people. The Sultan claims tradition. The Allies claim authority through victory. Each claim demands obedience. Only one will survive. By 1922, the nationalist forces launched the Great Offensive. Greek lines collapse. The retreat becomes chaotic. Fires consume parts of Smyrna, and the smoke rises over the harbor as refugees crowd the waterfront. The air is thick with ash and fear. People scream for boats. Soldiers drop rifles and run. Civilians cling to bundles. The war ends not with a neat handshake, but with scenes of desperation that stain memory. In November 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolishes the Ottoman dynasty, which began as a frontier house under Osman, ends as a legal decision made in a new political center. Mehmed VI leaves Istanbul. He boards a ship and departs under foreign protection. The image is almost unbearable in its symbolism. The last sultan of a 6th century empire leaves his capital not at the head of an army, but as a displaced figure carried away by the same powers that occupied his city. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognizes the boundaries of the new Turkish state. Later that year, the Republic of Turkey is proclaimed. Istanbul remains, but the empire does not. Now look back across the centuries and feel the weight of what has happened. The Ottomans built an empire from frontier raids and turned it into a disciplined machine. They created the Janissaries to guarantee loyalty and used them to conquer continents. Then the Janissaries learned their own strength and turned into a threat that sultans had to destroy with cannons. The Ottomans formalized fratricide to prevent civil war, and in doing so they trained princes and mothers to live inside paranoia. Later, they replaced fratricide with confinement and confinement, produced rulers who lacked experience, leaving power to ministers and factions. The empire survived each crisis and grew skilled at improvisation. And that skill also became a trap. Survival encouraged denial. The state learned to keep going, even when it should have changed sooner. In the end, the empire did not fall only because enemies attacked. It fell because the world changed and the Ottoman system struggled to adapt without tearing itself apart. It fell because modern war demanded industrial capacity the empire could not match. It fell because nationalism offered a new story that imperial hierarchy could not compete with. It fell because fear drove decisions that created lasting wounds. It fell because a state built to expand found itself forced to retreat. And retreat does not feed an imperial soul. Yet even as the empire dies, its remnants shape the world that follows. The streets of Istanbul still echo with footsteps. The domes still hold the sky. The palace corridors still remember the soft scrape of silk and the sharper sound of a cord tightening in a dark room. The empire ends, but the memory stays. Complicated and heavy, full of brilliance and cruelty, full of survival and self-destruction. That's it. History is not just a memory from the past, but a living legacy that shapes the present. As we complete this vast panorama of the Ottomans, we must never forget these traces that shed light on the future. See you in the next video. Take care.